house had been quiet for so long that Miriam had stopped noticing the silence. That was the thing about grief. It didn't announce itself every morning. It just settled in, like dust on the windowsills, until you forgot what clean air felt like. 18 months since the accident. 18 months since her son Owen had last hummed to himself while eating breakfast. Since he'd last kicked his sneakers off at the door and left them crooked in the hallway. Since he'd done any of the small, careless things that children do when they feel safe enough not to think about it. Now he was careful about everything. He ate quietly. He walked quietly. He sat at the kitchen table and stared at his cereal until the milk went warm, and when Miriam asked him what he was thinking about, he would look at her with those dark eyes, his father's eyes, and say, "Nothing, Mom." And she believed him, because the alternative was too hard to sit with. Miriam Hale had built a career on not flinching. As the CFO of Caldwell Vance Capital Group, she had walked into boardrooms during the 2008 collapse and kept her voice level while men twice her age came apart at the seams. She had restructured debt portfolios that other firms had written off as unsalvageable. She had been called ruthless, efficient, brilliant, and she had accepted all three without argument, because in finance, those words were the same as saying, "You survive." But she couldn't fix Owen. She had tried everything, 3 different therapists. Art therapy on Tuesday afternoons, which he tolerated with polite indifference, a grief support group for kids, which he attended twice and then refused to go back to without explanation. She'd bought him a dog, a golden retriever named Biscuit, who Owen fed and walked with mechanical dutifulness and never once played with. The dog had taken to sleeping outside Owen's bedroom door every night, as if waiting for something Miriam couldn't name. It had been 11 months since Owen had laughed. She knew the exact date, November 3rd. He'd been watching a nature documentary about penguins, and something had struck him as funny. She never even knew what. And the laugh had come out of him sudden and surprised, like something that had escaped before he could stop it. He'd looked at her right after, almost guilty, and the laugh had died as quickly as it came. She pretended not to notice. She'd gone back to her laptop and stared at a spreadsheet she wasn't reading, and listened to the silence settle back in around them both. She had stopped hoping for the laugh to come back, until the Tuesday in March when she heard it. It was late, past 10, which meant Owen should have been asleep for over an hour. Miriam was at her home office desk, finalizing the Q1 projection she'd need for Thursday's board presentation, when the sound floated up through the floor vent. Thin and distant, like music from a neighboring apartment. She went still. It happened again. She pushed back from her desk slowly, the way you move when you're afraid that any sudden motion might break a spell. She walked to the hallway and stood at the top of the stairs and listened. Laughter. Owen's laughter. Not the polite kind. Not the kind children perform for adults who are watching. Real laughter. The breathless, uncontrolled kind that happens when something catches you completely off guard. Her first thought was that he'd snuck his tablet into bed and was watching something. Her second thought, arriving half a second later and landing with considerably more weight, was that she could hear a second voice. Low, male, patient. Her hand found the banister. She had installed a security system 14 months ago after a series of break-ins 2 blocks over that turned out to be nothing serious, but had shaken her enough to spend $6,000 on cameras and motion sensors. She'd forgotten about most of it within the month. The alerts came in for raccoons, for the mail carrier, for leaves blowing across the sensor range. She'd turned the audible notifications off and barely checked the app anymore. But now she pulled out her phone as she descended the stairs, opened the app with the particular focus she reserved for moments of crisis, and navigated to the back garden camera. The footage was in the bluish tint of night vision. At the edge of the garden, near the old oak tree that Owen had never once climbed, she could see 2 figures, one small, one kneeling. Owen was sitting on the garden bench in his pajamas, his feet not quite reaching the ground. The man kneeling in front of him, her groundskeeper, she recognized the jacket, was holding his hands up in the yellow light from the porch, and even through the grainy camera, Miriam could see what he was doing. Shadow puppets. Not the basic kind, not a flat-handed duck or a simple rabbit with 2 fingers. These were detailed and deliberate, a running fox, a bird landing on a branch, something that took a long moment to resolve into the shape of an elephant lifting its trunk. Owen's face was tilted up, watching, and every few seconds, he made that sound. Miriam sat down on the bottom stair. She watched for a long time without moving. Her phone grew warm in her hand. At one point, the man, his name was Garrett, she remembered. He'd been hired through a landscaping service 6 weeks ago, came on Thursdays and sometimes Tuesdays, seemed to say something that made Owen cover his mouth with both hands and shake silently with the effort of not laughing too loud, like he understood instinctively that this was a secret and the secret was precious, and he wanted to protect it. The boardroom version of Miriam Hale would have had the man off her property within the hour. But she sat on the bottom stair and watched her son laugh in the dark, and she didn't move for a very long time. She went to bed at midnight without confronting either of them. She told herself it was because Garrett had already gone home by then, that Owen was already back in bed, that there was no logical action to take at this hour. All of that was true. But the deeper truth, the one she would only admit to herself in the dark, was that she was afraid of what might happen if she said something, that the laughter might stop again, and this time for good. She pulled up his background check the next morning before her first call. Garrett Mullen, 38 years old, licensed through Heron Park Landscaping Services. Former occupation, emergency medicine physician. She read that twice. She called the landscaping company. Dr. Mullen, the woman on the phone sounded faintly uncomfortable. He's one of our best workers, very reliable, comes with excellent references. I'm not questioning his reliability, Miriam said. I'm asking why a physician is cutting grass. A pause. I'm not in a position to speak to our employees' personal histories. Miriam thanked her and hung up. Then she opened a different browser and started doing what she was actually good at, following money. What she found took her the rest of the morning and made her Q1 presentation feel very far away. 3 years ago, Garrett Mullen had been the attending physician in the pediatric emergency unit at Mercy General. By every account she could locate, and Miriam was very good at locating accounts, he had been considered exceptional. The kind of doctor residents followed around with notebooks, the kind that patients asked for by name. Then, 2.5 years ago, a lawsuit had been filed against him. Medical malpractice. A child who had come into his unit had died, and the family had alleged negligence. The case had settled out of court, and Garrett Mullen's medical license had been suspended pending review. The review had taken 14 months. By the time his license was reinstated, he was out of medicine. His reputation quietly dissolved, and his daughter, she found a mention in a community newsletter, small and easy to miss, was being raised without a mother who had apparently left sometime during the worst of it. He had a daughter, 6 years old, named Fern. Miriam sat back in her chair. She thought about Caldwell Bance's subsidiary in healthcare infrastructure. She thought about a name she had tried not to think about for 2.5 years. The Mercy General Pediatric Unit Expansion Project, which Caldwell Vance had helped finance, which had involved a restructuring of the hospital's insurance portfolio that she had personally overseen, which had resulted in coverage gaps that the hospital's legal team had quietly exploited when the malpractice claims came in. She had known about the coverage gaps. She had flagged them in an internal memo. She had been told by 2 senior partners that the restructuring was already done and the memo would be noted. The child who had died in Garrett Mullen's unit had died partly because the equipment he'd needed wasn't available. The equipment hadn't been available because of a supply contract that had lapsed during the restructuring that Miriam had overseen. She had not let herself connect those dots before. She understood now, sitting in her bright office with her coffee going cold, that she had not wanted to. Garrett Mullen hadn't been negligent. He'd been working with what he had, and what he had hadn't been enough because of a chain of decisions that ended, if you followed it back far enough, at a desk very much like the one she was sitting at now. She didn't go to work that Thursday. She told her assistant she had a family matter. She sat in her living room and read every document she could find related to the Mercy General restructuring, the malpractice case, and the coverage gaps. She made a list, in her careful, precise handwriting, of everyone who had known. Then she made a separate list of everyone who should have known but had been deliberately kept from knowing. That list was shorter. She was on it. She was still sitting there when she heard the front door open. Thursday. She'd forgotten it was Thursday. Garrett came in through the side gate, the way he always did. She watched him through the kitchen window. He hadn't seen her. She'd left only the backlight on. He set down his equipment bag and walked around the corner of the house toward the garden shed. And then he stopped. Owen was sitting on the back steps. Miriam stayed very still. She couldn't hear what was said, but she watched Owen look up at Garrett and say something, and she watched Garrett crouch down to his level. Not the patronizing crouch adults do when they want children to feel small, but the genuine one, knee to the ground, eye to eye, and listen. Really listen. And then he said something back, and Owen nodded, and something in the set of her son's shoulders went loose in a way she hadn't seen in 18 months. She went outside. Garrett stood up when he heard the door. He was taller than she'd registered before. She'd only ever seen him at a distance, from upstairs windows. He had the careful, composed face of someone who had been through things and had decided, at some point, to stop wearing them on the outside. "Mrs. Hale," he said. "Ms.," she said automatically. "Then, I need to speak with you." Owen looked between them. Garrett glanced at the boy briefly and said, easily, "Go check on Biscuit." I think he was scratching at the side gate. Owen went without argument. That too was new. They stood in the garden, 6 feet of dead winter grass between them, and Miriam said, "I know who you are." Something moved across his face. Not guilt, not fear, something quieter and more complicated than either of those things. "Then you know more than most people bother to find out," he said. "The Mercy General restructuring," she said. "Caldwell Vance Capital, the supply contract that lapsed. The equipment shortage in the pediatric unit." She paused. "I was the CFO on that project." The silence that followed was very long. "I know," Garrett said. She stared at him. "You knew before you took this job?" He looked away, toward the oak tree. "I found out about 2 months in. I looked up the address, the name. I almost quit." He paused. Fern, my daughter, had gotten attached to the idea of me having steady work. She'd started drawing pictures of the garden. I didn't want to take that away from her, too. "You should have told me." "And said what?" He looked back at her. There was nothing accusatory in his voice, just honest and tired, which was somehow worse. That I wasn't sure whether to keep working for the woman whose company helped destroy my career. I didn't know what I was going to do. I still don't. He looked toward the direction Owen had gone. "But whatever it is, it has nothing to do with your son." She believed him. She didn't entirely know why, but she believed him completely. "Owen doesn't talk," she said. Her voice came out different than she expected, stripped of its professional register, just the plain fact of it. "He hasn't, not really, since his father died, the accident." She stopped. "He laughed last night. I saw you on the camera." Garrett was quiet. "How did you know about the shadow animals?" she asked. "His father used to do them. When Owen was very small, he had a specific one, a fox, with the ears." She demonstrated uselessly with her own hands. Something shifted in Garrett's expression. "Your husband, in the accident. He was the man in the blue sedan who stopped to help with the truck spill on the interchange." He said it slowly, like he was reading from a document he'd memorized a long time ago. "He got out of his car. He was directing people away from the fuel spill when a second vehicle lost control. He stopped. I was the doctor on call when they brought him in. I had seen him in the parking lot outside the ER 2 weeks before. He was there with Owen for a broken wrist. He was doing the shadow animals on the wall to keep the boy calm while they waited for imaging." He paused. "I remembered. I don't know why I used them with Owen. It was an instinct. I didn't realize he would recognize them." Miriam sat down on the garden bench. She didn't plan to. Her legs simply made the decision. Her husband had died trying to help strangers. The man standing in front of her had tried to save him, and then had lost his own career because of a chain of institutional failures that she had been a link in. And somehow, through some routing of events that no one could have designed on purpose, this man's patience and his memory and his particular way of kneeling down to a child's eye level had reached inside her son and found something she hadn't been able to find in 18 months of trying. She didn't cry. She had mostly stopped crying in front of people when she was around 32. But she sat on the bench and pressed her hands flat against her knees and breathed. "What happened to the family?" she said. "The child who died in your unit. Do you know where they are?" "I do," Garrett said. "I stayed in contact, informally." "I want to make it right," she said, "whatever that means. Financially, legally. I want to open the Caldwell Vance records on that restructuring. All of them. I want to know what my partners knew and when, and then I want to do what I should have done when I wrote that memo." Garrett looked at her for a long time. "That will cost you," he said. "I know. Not just money." "I know that too." He nodded once, slowly, not like he was impressed, more like he was simply registering the information. "You should know," he said carefully, "that it won't make what happened to your husband different, or what happened to that child. You understand that?" "Yes," she said, "I understand that." What followed was not fast or clean or cinematic. Real accountability almost never is. Miriam spent 3 weeks pulling files that hadn't been touched since the restructuring. She hired a forensic accountant who reported directly to her and no one else. She brought in outside legal counsel, not Caldwell-Bance's retained firm, which had too many reasons to prefer the status quo. She compiled a record of the coverage gaps when they had been identified, who had been told what had been said in response. She found 3 separate internal communications in which she had flagged the risks and been overruled, and 2 in which senior partners had explicitly chosen not to pass the information upward to the hospital's board. She presented the file to the full Caldwell-Vance board on a Thursday morning. She told them what she had found. She told them what she intended to do with it. She watched the faces of the men who had overruled her memos go through a rapid progression of emotions. Disbelief, then calculation, then something that looked very much like fear. One of them, a senior partner named Dennis, who had a handshake like a wet fish and an impeccable reputation, actually suggested that the relevant statute of limitations had passed, and perhaps this was a matter better handled internally. "I don't intend to handle it internally," Miriam said. She had already filed the referral to the state insurance commissioner that morning. It took 7 months. There were attorneys, depositions, long calls at hours that should have been reserved for sleep. 3 of the senior partners resigned. 2 were removed. Caldwell-Vance's stock dropped sharply in the second quarter and had only partially recovered by the end of the year. 2 journalists who had been following insurance restructuring irregularities for different publications received document packages that Miriam had arranged with careful attention to what was legally permissible and what was not. She did not resign. She had considered it and then decided it would be too easy, that the work of fixing what was broken was better done from where she was standing than from some cleaner distance. The settlement reached with the family of the child who had died was sealed, as settlements tend to be. Miriam's own contribution to it was not required by law and was not publicly disclosed. She did it because the memo she had written 3 years ago, the one that had been noted and set aside, deserved to mean something in retrospect. Garrett's medical license, which had already been reinstated, was not the obstacle he thought it was. The thing that had kept him out of medicine wasn't the licensing board. It was simpler and harder than that. It was that he had stopped trusting his own hands. The taking of trust can be done by one bad outcome, and 9 months of depositions and a daughter looking up at you from her drawings and asking why you seemed sad. He went back to medicine in the fall, not at Mercy General, a smaller pediatric clinic on the east side of the city, the kind of place that runs on grant funding and irregular hours and staff who stay because they actually want to be there. He worked Tuesdays, Thursdays, and every other Saturday. On the Thursdays, when he didn't work the garden, he'd stayed on through the spring, long after it made professional sense, because Owen had begun talking again, and they were both pretending this was a coincidence. He sometimes came by in the evening instead, and the 3 of them would eat dinner at the table in the kitchen, which Miriam had started setting for 3 without quite deciding to. Fern came sometimes. She was 6 going on 7, with her father's deliberate way of listening and a habit of arranging whatever objects were near her into small, precise groupings. A row of forks, a lineup of rocks by the garden path, that Owen found inexplicably fascinating. The 2 children had reached some kind of understanding that didn't require adults to broker it. Owen had shown her the shadow animals. She had shown him a way of folding paper that produced, after much effort, a surprisingly convincing frog. Biscuit had finally started sleeping inside Owen's room. Miriam noticed, one evening in October, that Owen had left his sneakers crooked by the front door. She stepped over them on her way to the kitchen, and then stopped and stood still for a moment in the hallway. She left them exactly where they were. There was a night, late November, the kitchen warm with something Garrett had insisted on cooking because Miriam's idea of dinner had previously involved a lot of delivery apps and low ambitions, when Owen looked across the table at his mother with his father's eyes and said, out of nowhere, Dad would have liked him. Miriam set down her fork. "Yes," she said after a moment. "I think so too." Owen nodded, satisfied, and went back to his food. Garrett didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He had the particular quality of knowing when silence is the right response, which is rarer than most people think and more valuable than almost anything. Later, after the kids were upstairs and the kitchen was quiet, Miriam stood at the sink and thought about the memo she had written 3 years ago, the one she had sent and watched disappear. She thought about what it would have cost her then to do more than write it, to push harder, to refuse to let it be set aside, to make the kind of noise that disrupts a career and makes powerful men uncomfortable and marks you as the kind of person who is not a team player. She thought about what that memo had cost Garrett instead, what it had cost that family, what it had cost Owen in a route so indirect that no court would ever trace it. She turned off the tap and dried her hands and went to check on the children. The house was not quiet anymore. It had the low-grade ambient sound of people who had settled into each other, Footsteps on the stairs, ferns humming, the particular creak of the second-floor hallway that Owen had always known how to avoid, but lately didn't bother to. It sounded different than it used to. It sounded like something that had been broken a long time ago, slowly, imperfectly, finding its way back. I keep thinking about the memo. Not the depositions, not the settlement, not the moment Miriam stood in that boardroom and watched Dennis try to talk his way out of something he'd known about for 3 years. I keep coming back to the memo. The one she wrote, the one that got noted, the one that sat in a folder while a supply contract lapsed and a child died and a good doctor lost everything he'd built. She wrote it, she flagged it, and then she let it be set aside because the cost of pushing harder felt too high at the time. That's the part I can't stop thinking about. Not because she was a bad person. I don't think she was. I think she was a person who had learned, the way a lot of people learn, that there is a version of doing the right thing that stops just short of the moment it gets expensive. You write the memo. You note your objection. You create a paper trail that lets you tell yourself later that you tried. And then you move on because you have a career and a team and a board presentation on Thursday and the world is full of risks you can't personally fix. The problem is that someone always pays for the risks you don't fix. It just usually isn't you. What I find most honest about Miriam's story is that she already knew this. She didn't need Garrett to explain it to her. The moment she pulled those files and followed that chain of decisions back to her own desk, she understood exactly what her silence had cost, not because she was finally confronted with it, but because she had always been smart enough to see it and had chosen, very deliberately, not to look directly at it. That kind of intelligence without integrity isn't wisdom. It's just a more sophisticated way of avoiding accountability. Garrett is the counterweight to that. He lost his career, his marriage, his professional identity, all of it, because of a failure in a system he had no control over. And he didn't become bitter. He became careful. He kept showing up. He took a job cutting grass, and he got down on his knees in the dark to make shadow animals for a child who had stopped speaking, not because it would fix anything, not because anyone was watching, but because he had the kind of moral steadiness that doesn't require an audience. That's not a personality trait you're born with. That's something built, slowly, out of the decision to keep going when the easier thing would be to stop. Owen teaching Fern the shadow fox. Fern showing Owen the paper frog. 2 kids in a kitchen, figuring out how to be in the world again, because 2 adults decided that doing right by them mattered more than self-protection. There's a kind of cause and effect in that which I find more reliable than luck. Not guaranteed, not always visible in the moment, but real. I think about what it takes to write the memo and then actually push. To do the harder, more expensive, less comfortable version of what you already know is right. Miriam eventually got there. 7 months of depositions and a stock price that made her board very unhappy and a settlement that will never be public. She got there because a groundskeeper made shadow animals in the dark, and her son laughed for the first time in 11 months, and something in her cracked open enough to let the truth back in. That's the long way around. Most of us take it anyway. The question worth sitting with isn't whether you do the right thing when the cost is low. It's what you do when the cost is real.